The old man's hands trembled as he unfolded a faded photograph. In it stood 12 young soldiers, smiling confidently at the camera. Only 3 of them would survive. For more than 50 years, he carried the memories of a war that destroyed cities, separated families, and turned young dreamers into weary survivors. This is not a story about famous generals or powerful rulers. It is the story of ordinary people whose lives were changed forever when war arrived at their doorstep. Some would become heroes. Some would make impossible choices. Some would never return home. And at the center of it all stood a young man named Michael Harrison, who would discover that the greatest battles are not always fought with guns, but within the human heart. Tonight, I will tell you the story of the war that stole tomorrow. But before we begin, if you enjoy powerful stories like this one, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future stories. Now, sit back, and let me take you back to a time when the world changed forever, and when one young man's journey through war began. The last peaceful morning. The morning began like every other. Michael Harrison walked through the town square, greeting familiar faces and enjoying the warm sunshine. Children laughed on their way to school while merchants opened their shops. Nobody seemed worried about anything beyond the ordinary struggles of daily life. Then, shortly before noon, a military truck sped into town. Soldiers jumped out and began posting emergency notices. People gathered around in confusion. Within minutes, the shocking news spread everywhere. Enemy forces had crossed the border. War had begun. The peaceful world Michael knew was suddenly gone forever. That evening, families crowded around their radios, hoping the reports were exaggerated. They were not. The government announced a nationwide mobilization. Every able-bodied young man was expected to serve. Michael's name appeared on the list the following morning. His mother tried to hide her tears while his father remained silent. Everyone understood what this meant. Some of the young men leaving town would never return. Michael packed a small bag and stared at his childhood home one last time. As the military truck arrived, a terrible feeling settled deep inside his chest. The training camp was unlike anything Michael had imagined. The officers shouted constantly. Sleep became a luxury. Every mistake brought punishment. The recruits learned to march, shoot, and survive under exhausting conditions. Many wanted to quit, but nobody was allowed to leave. Slowly, frightened civilians transformed into disciplined soldiers. Michael befriended 3 recruits named Daniel, Eric, and Thomas. Together they endured the hardship and encouraged one another. Their friendship helped them survive the difficult weeks ahead. Yet every day brought them closer to the battlefield, and none truly knew what awaited them there. Weeks later, their unit reached the front line. The sound of distant artillery shook the ground beneath their feet. Smoke covered the horizon like a dark storm cloud. Michael stared at the destruction in disbelief. Nothing from training had prepared him for this sight. Abandoned vehicles littered the roads. Damaged buildings stood like broken skeletons against the sky. Veteran soldiers moved with grim expressions. They knew what the newcomers did not. Before sunrise the next day, Michael would experience his first battle. And his life would never be the same again. The attack began before dawn. Explosions erupted around the trenches as enemy artillery pounded their position. Michael's hands shook as bullets tore through the air above him. Soldiers shouted orders while others cried out in fear. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Hours felt like days. By the time the fighting ended, several men from his company were dead. One recruit he had spoken with the previous evening was among them. Michael stared at the body in silence. War was no longer a distant event. It was now his reality. After the battle, the unit advanced into a nearby village. The place was eerily silent. Meals sat unfinished on tables. Doors hung open. Children's toys remained scattered in empty streets. It looked as though everyone had vanished in an instant. Michael entered one house and found family photographs still hanging on the walls. Whoever lived there had left everything behind. The soldiers searched carefully, expecting an ambush. Instead, they found only silence. As they prepared to leave, Michael wondered where the villagers had gone, and whether they would ever see their homes again. As the months passed, Michael grew closer to Daniel, Eric, and Thomas. They shared food, stories, and dreams of life after the war. Around campfires they spoke about families waiting for them back home. These conversations became their escape from the horrors surrounding them. The four men promised that when the war ended, they would meet again and celebrate together. It was a comforting thought. None of them knew how fragile those dreams truly were. In war, tomorrow is never guaranteed. And fate was already preparing to test their friendship in terrible ways. Enemy soldiers slipped through the darkness and struck the camp shortly after midnight. Explosions shattered the silence. Tents caught fire. Panic spread everywhere. Michael grabbed his rifle and followed Daniel toward the defensive positions. The battle raged through the night. Shadows moved between flashes of gunfire. Friend and enemy became difficult to distinguish. By dawn, the attack had been repelled. But the cost was heavy. Several familiar faces were missing from breakfast that morning. Empty seats around the campfire served as painful reminders of the night's violence. A few days later, Michael helped guard a group of captured enemy soldiers. He expected ruthless killers. Instead, he saw frightened young men no different from himself. One prisoner carried a photograph of his family. Another spoke about missing his children. The realization disturbed Michael deeply. These men had dreams, fears, and loved ones waiting at home. Yet war had turned them into enemies. That night, Michael struggled to sleep. The line separating good and evil suddenly seemed less clear. Perhaps both sides were losing far more than they could ever gain. Their commanders launched a massive offensive against a heavily defended position known as Iron Ridge. Thousands of soldiers participated. Artillery thundered for hours before the attack began. Michael advanced through smoke and chaos as explosions erupted around him. Every meter gained came at a terrible price. The battlefield quickly became a nightmare of destruction. By sunset, the ridge had been captured. Victory belonged to them. Yet the celebration felt hollow. Too many friends had fallen during the assault. Standing among the ruins, Michael began questioning whether any victory was truly worth such sacrifice. One rainy afternoon, a mail truck arrived at the camp. The soldiers gathered eagerly, hoping to hear their names called. Michael was lucky. A letter from home awaited him. His mother's handwriting immediately brought a smile to his face. She wrote about the family farm, his sister's studies, and how everyone prayed for his safe return. For a few precious minutes, the war seemed far away. But as he folded the letter, distant artillery echoed across the valley. Reality returned. The battlefield did not care about memories. Another operation was already being planned. The next mission took Michael's unit deep into enemy territory. Resistance was fierce from the moment they arrived. During the fighting, Daniel was struck by enemy fire while helping another wounded soldier. Michael rushed to his side and tried desperately to help him. Daniel managed a weak smile before gripping Michael's hand tightly. He spoke only a few final words before falling silent forever. The battle continued around them, but Michael barely heard it. He had lost more than a friend. He had lost a brother. The promise they made around the campfire would never be fulfilled. As winter arrived, conditions became unbearable. Snow covered the battlefield, and freezing winds cut through every layer of clothing. Supplies became scarce. Many soldiers suffered from sickness and exhaustion. Hunger became a daily companion. Some men spoke openly about giving up hope. Every morning brought news of another casualty, not always from bullets but from the brutal cold itself. Michael often stared at the grey sky and wondered if he would ever see home again. Yet despite everything, the fighting continued. The war seemed determined to consume whatever strength they had left. Months later, Michael's unit entered a city that had once been home to thousands. Now it was little more than rubble and smoke. Entire neighborhoods had been destroyed. Families searched desperately through the wreckage for loved ones. Children wandered the streets without parents. Michael helped rescue survivors trapped beneath collapsed buildings. The sights haunted him more than any battlefield. This was not a military victory. It was human tragedy. As night fell, he looked across the ruined city and realized something painful. Even if the war ended tomorrow, the scars would remain for generations. The final battle came when nobody had much strength left. Both armies were exhausted. Both wanted the war to end. Yet one last confrontation stood between them and peace. The fighting lasted 3 days. Smoke covered the horizon, and the sound of artillery never seemed to stop. Michael fought through fear, grief, and exhaustion. When the battle finally ended, the enemy surrendered. The war was over. Months later, Michael returned home. His mother cried with joy. His father embraced him. His sister hardly recognized the man who had left years earlier. The young teacher who once worried about exams and football matches was gone. War had changed him forever. The old veteran looked at the faded photograph in his hands. Of the 12 smiling soldiers in the picture, only 3 survived. The world remembers who won the war, he said softly. But the families remember who never came home. He placed the photograph on the table and stared into the distance. Never be quick to celebrate war. The cost is always greater than people imagine. Moral lesson. War may end on the battlefield, but its wounds remain in the hearts of those who survive. True strength is not found in conflict, but in preserving peace whenever possible.